Assassin's Creed Valhalla released back in 2020 to some pretty huge success, becoming the most successful game in the franchise by earning over $1 billion in revenue. Now, several years later, we're closing in on the launch of Assassin's Creed Shadows, and as someone who never tried Valhalla before, I decided to sacrifice my wallet for you guys in order to answer that age-old question, is it worth it? First and foremost, I should probably mention that I'm one of those older AC fans. I loved the first 4 games where you play as Altair, Ezio, Connor, and Edward Kenway. Suffice it to say, Assassin's Creed isn't new to me. It's a franchise I liked a lot in my younger years, but I fell out of love with it as time went on. Now, as Assassin's Creed Valhalla covers the Viking Age, it should by all means be in my wheelhouse, considering that I'm Swedish myself. And so we get to the first positive thing about this game. I really like that the game actually starts out in southern Norway, specifically in Stavanger, which is honestly not too far from my own home. I think the intro is also pretty solid, and you get a good feel for what motivates the player character, Eivor. The game also doesn't pull any punches here, as we quickly go from the usual joyful Scandinavian festivities to a complete slaughterfest with Eivor's mother and father getting brutally executed by a rival clan, with Eivor having to flee for her life, only to run into a wolf that tries to eat her, giving her a scar on her neck that earns her the nickname the Wolf-Kissed. We then start out many years later when Eivor is a grown, battle-scarred woman, and we pick up her quest of vengeance against Kjotve the Cruel, the man who murdered her family. This also brings us to Eivor herself. Now, you can either play as a female or a male version of Eivor, and here I picked the female version because I've mostly seen footage of the male version in the past few years. Nonetheless, there's obviously more to Eivor than her quest for vengeance, and just like in true AC fashion, Eivor has a grander destiny than she thinks. I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised with how much I like Eivor as a protagonist. I wouldn't call her memorable in the ways that, for example, Ezio is, but I think she's pretty likable. This also brings us to the voice actors for Eivor, that being Magnus Brun for the male version and Cecily Stenspiel for the female version. And I think both of them do a good job with their respective roles, and I really like that Ubisoft actually cast 2 Danish people for their roles here.
Hytham, I mean no disrespect to you or the Hidden Ones, but Kjotve is mine. My family's honor is at stake.
It's actually pretty funny to, as a Scandinavian, be able to pick out certain rhythms and dialects as they're speaking, which absolutely helps with immersion. Now, I realize most of you probably aren't Scandinavian, still this aspect has my personal stamp of approval, so if you're wondering if the main character feels and sounds like an actual Viking, then I'd say yes. That said, I'm afraid I can't speak much on the rest of the characters in the game, except for a few standouts. Eivor the Boneless, who's one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, is definitely one of my favorites so far, and he's depicted pretty much how he's been described in previous stories, being a bloodthirsty butcherer with a penchant for chaos. Now, there are some other characters that are admittedly pretty cool too, but as I don't want to spoil too much, I'll just refrain from naming them. In any case, Eivor and her crew does at some point journey to England in search of new land, and much of the story revolves around raiding and pillaging England in order to build a new future for Eivor's clan, which is a novel concept in of itself. And as someone who watched Vikings all the way through, I have to admit that I've been itching to play a game revolving around raiding other countries. I guess deep down, my ancestors were just waiting for Ubisoft to give me permission. Seriously though, I think Ubisoft had the right idea with the whole raiding and plundering. I mean, it clearly worked with Black Flag, where you play as a pirate, and so it works just as well here. That brings us to the gameplay itself, and as previously mentioned, raiding is an actual activity in the game. There are tons of settlements and small villages in Valhalla, and you can raid pretty much every one of them. And I have to say that when it comes to this section alone, Valhalla really delivers. There's just something really primal about Eivor blowing her horn and your crew screaming at the top of their lungs as you shore up on an unsuspecting settlement, butchering all of its defenders. Obviously, it's not just about killing though, but looting too, and you'll be looting everything from settlements to Christian monasteries that contain tons of treasures and supplies that you'll be then using to build up your settlement. Again, the raiding and pillaging part of Valhalla is really what carries the game for me, just like how the ship-to-ship combat and pirating carried Black Flag. Now that also brings us to combat, and well, this is a pretty mixed bag for me. On one hand, the game tries to marry the idea of being an assassin and a Viking, one being a silent killer and the other being a loud berserker, and well, it just doesn't jive very well. Honestly, the whole concept of assassination feels very underbaked in comparison to regular combat, even more so than in previous games like, for example, Odyssey. You see, being an assassin in this franchise is mostly built on the idea of silently killing your target and then slipping away as if you were never there. And well, aside from a select few missions, this tactic is just not very effective in Valhalla. You'll honestly just get the job done quicker and in a much more fun way by just charging in like a bull. Combine this with some admittedly awesome finishing moves whenever using any weapons other than the wrist blade, and well, the assassin type gameplay just flies out the window. Now, on one hand, I don't like this very much because I do miss when the franchise was more focused on being a silent and effective killer. But on the other hand, the balls-to-the-walls brutality of being a Viking is something that the team that made this game has to be commended on, and it's absolutely what this game does best. The fact that they've gone all in on the gore and the violence also makes the combat much more visceral and satisfying, and it's definitely a step in the right direction, especially so since you're playing as a Viking. Now, the subdued presence of the Assassin Order is also felt throughout the story, especially so in the first 20 hours or so, and because of that, the presence of present-day characters like Layla is fairly small as well. The sections where you actually play in present day when you go outside the Animus are thankfully fairly short, but I can't help but feel like they could have just skipped these entirely. Honestly, I'm finding it hard to care too much about the present day story, and at this point, it feels like they're trying too hard to replicate Desmond's story from the first games. And as far as I've read, most fans seem to agree on this point. The modern day sections of these newer Assassin's Creed games just aren't terribly interesting, simply because the mystery of the Isu, which is the omnipresent quote-unquote gods of the Assassin's Creed universe, was tied up with Desmond's story. And at this point, I'd much prefer if Ubisoft simply skipped the modern day sections because they simply break up the pacing too much, especially so since they're not very interesting. Now, I know what some of you are gonna say, but it's Assassin's Creed, you need the Animus and a modern day story for these games. And I disagree with this sentiment wholeheartedly. I think most fans of this franchise has realized by now that Ubisoft are actively trying to steer away from the whole Animus section of this franchise, and Valhalla is probably the biggest point of evidence to this. The game does the Viking sections really well, but all the assassin type stuff is just underwhelming, which is a little sad, but at this day and age, I think it's a moot point. Another thing that Valhalla does really well is scale. I don't think I've ever played a game that just feels as big as Valhalla. I mean, you have the entire section of southwestern Norway, South England, parts of Ireland, and France to explore. Suffice it to say, Valhalla is massive in an almost bizarre way. And while I enjoyed the idea of being able to explore a pretty close representation of the real world, this also works against the game. You see, in my first 10 hours or so, my feeling was that,
hey, that's pretty good.
Exploring the world, raiding, pillaging, and looting is actually fun. But you see, after an additional 10 hours or so, my enjoyment factor started dropping quickly, because I realized that the gameplay loop is pretty much the same after the 10th hour, to the 20th hour, to the 30th hour, and so on. Alas, many more hours into the game, I realized that just like the Far Cry franchise in its later stages, Assassin's Creed Valhalla turned into a showcase for just how huge these worlds can get, but without much substance to go with it. Sure, there are side quests here and there, and some encounters you have are pretty interesting, but most of these activities are fairly forgettable, and at one point I actively started thinking about other things and scrolling through my phone, listening to podcasts and so on, because I simply felt unengaged. Look, I love looting and exploring as much as the next guy, but at a certain point the game just buckles from being stretched too thin. There's just not enough interesting content to justify exploring these admittedly gorgeous representations of various European countries. What's that age-old saying? Ah yes, as wide as an ocean, as deep as a puddle. Or well, a puddle that reaches just above your knees, so it's not really that bad. Now for the final section of this current day review, I also want to mention a very important thing. The game is unfortunately in a pretty sorry state. It's been more than 4 years, and so I expected this game to be sufficiently polished as to make sure players get as smooth of an experience as possible, but I have to say that it's been anything but smooth. Aside from some hilarious bugs a la Skyrim, like flying boats and people, Valhalla also has a propensity to crash at a moment's notice. Now my issue was that my game kept crashing at certain thresholds, and after a lot of research, it turned out that my game kept trying to unlock achievements, which caused the game to crash, and so I had to go offline in order for it not to crash. And after looking up the issue, I realized that this is a bigger problem than I imagined, as tons of players have just given up on trying to play the game because it keeps crashing on them. And so at the end of the day, this actually made me change my mind on my final verdict. Because I was going to say that, yeah, I'd say Assassin's Creed Valhalla is worth buying for 20 to 30 bucks or so if it's on discount, simply because the game in of itself is pretty enjoyable for at least 20 to 30 hours or so, perhaps even more so if you enjoy the standard Ubisoft gameplay loop. But because they seem to have abandoned the game in its current technical state, I just cannot recommend getting it at all, especially so since at the point where you are experiencing constant crashes, you'll most likely be too far in to request a refund, which on Steam is timed at 2 hours of game time. Again, this sucks because the actual game isn't actually as terrible as I've heard, but the technical state is just baffling for a game that's been out for 4, soon to be 5 years. Also, this happens when you reach the point of unlocking the Dawn of Ragnarok expansion. No, that was not a mistake on my part. The game just has this lazily thrown in trailer with no sound, and it felt so random and out of place that I actually shook my head in disbelief. And that's just one of many examples that proves just how lazily the end product was put together. Anyway, hopefully Ubisoft has done a better job at polishing Assassin's Creed Shadows, but at this point, I completely understand why so many older fans are feeling rather ambivalent about this franchise. But I guess time will tell. Thank you to everyone in the Ensven Squad for supporting the channel, and remember, if you want to support me directly, you can become a channel member as well through the pinned comment below or through this button right here. This has been Mr. Holton, signing off.